Are you kidding me? He killed my best friend. He killed my best friend. This was the immediate reaction of Professor Abdul when he was tasked by the Tajikistan government to end civil war by approaching an enemy warlord who had killed his best friend. It would have been easy for the professor to refuse this request, considering he was still mourning over the loss of his friend. But instead, he found the courage to meet with the warlord for an allotted 20 minutes of time. They soon found themselves conversing about philosophy and poetry for over 2.5 hours. Eventually, the warlord asked the professor, "If I put down my weapons and go with you, can you guarantee my safety and life?" The professor responded, "I cannot guarantee your safety, but I can guarantee this. I will go with you, side by side, and if you die, I die." Now that's a very intense promise. If you die, I die. John Paul Lederach, professor of international peacebuilding, retold this compelling story in his book, The Moral Imagination. In my course, Self-Theater and Change, I've learned that Lederach defines the moral imagination as having the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. When you hear the word imagination, you may think that it really only applies to children. But as adults, it is also important that we imagine the possibilities for our world. Frank Underwood, the protagonist of the American drama series House of Cards, once stated, "Imagination is its own form of courage." Like the professor and the warlord, if we too had the courage to approach every human being through the lens of the moral imagination, our communities would inherently become more just. In order to embrace the moral imagination, we must follow 3 important steps. We need to take a risk, relate with one another, and then relax. Risk, relate, relax. Imagine a world where we don't run from fear, but rather we take a risk and face it head on. A wise person once said, "Take every risk, drop every fear." Fear can be very manipulative. Much of the propaganda used during wartime instills fear in the lives of many citizens around the world. The media dehumanizes enemy soldiers, and we see them as the faceless enemies. But why? Are they not humans with families and dreams just like us? Despite his great fear, the professor in our story took a risk and waded into the waters of the unknown. Entering into the unknown can be very intimidating, and not every risk we take is a matter of life or death. But we need to start somewhere. Fortunately, many Juniata students build up the courage to take a risk. At Juniata, over half of our students study abroad, so it is likely that many of you have studied abroad or you will in the near future. While abroad, you will meet people who may dress differently, look differently, or even speak differently from you. But that's okay. In order to imagine ourselves living in a morally just community, we must first take the risk of opening up our hearts and our minds to these differences. With these open hearts, we can relate with one another. Imagine a world where we build relationships with every human being, regardless of our differences. During my time at Juniata, I've traveled to a rural community in the Dominican Republic 5 times. It wasn't until recently that my real family had the opportunity to meet my new family. This past January, my father accompanied me and the other Juniata students on our trip. And while we were there, he was able to meet a man named Santiago, who I consider to be my dad's Dominican counterpart. My dad knew no Spanish, and Santiago knew no English, but despite the language barrier, they grew quite fond of one another. When it was time for us to leave, my dad and Santiago hugged each other for several minutes, with tears streaming from their eyes. For me, this was a very powerful moment. My dad and Santiago were able to find common ground regardless of their cultural differences. The professor and warlord from our story also came from very different cultural backgrounds, but they were able to build a relationship with one another even during wartime when they saw each other as enemies. Deborah Levine, editor-in-chief of the American Diversity Report, argues that if we are going to live with our deepest differences, then we must learn about one another. It is only by learning about and building relationships with one another that we can imagine a more just community. Imagine a world where we can relax and trust everyone around us. When I say that we must relax, I do not mean that we lounge around in our beach chairs, but rather we relax by letting go of always being right, by letting go of our prejudices, and by letting go of our control. This lesson can be a difficult one to learn. Last year, I spent 3 months writing a grant to build 10 raised garden beds in the Dominican Republic. But upon arriving to the community center, the founder of the center said that he wanted to build 1 large garden instead. At first, I was very reluctant and didn't want to change my very detailed plan. But then I remembered the garden would not be used by me, but rather it would be used by the community members. So I relinquished my control, and I was able to empower the community members by instilling my trust in their decision. Even Socrates, over 1,000 years ago, reminds us that the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. So instead of imposing my own beliefs and values, I relaxed my control and allowed the community members to teach me something new. Likewise, the warlord eventually relaxed and relinquished his control by trusting the professor with his life. When we learn to trust each other, we can now more easily imagine a moral and just community. Once we have the capacity to see ourselves as being in a web of relationships with every human being, including our enemy, there is no turning back. At Juniata, we have several opportunities to see the world through the lens of the moral imagination. We can study abroad, volunteer, join a service club. The list goes on. And in all of these scenarios, we will encounter people who are different from us. But instead of turning away and letting fear control us, we need to take a risk, relate with one another, and then relax. When we can see imagination as its own form of courage, our communities will undoubtedly become more just. Can you imagine the possibilities for our world? Imagine the difference we can make.